Good morning. There's a story that I like to reread each year about this time of year. It's a story that reminds me something deep of Christmas. It impacted thousands and thousands of people along the Western Front, soldiers, in 1914 around Christmas. The collection of stories is called The Christmas Truce. But two young fellows. Jim Prince was a British 18-year-old who loved playing football in his hometown. And he enlisted in the army, served his country in World War One. On the first day of fighting in Ypres, he was passing some bread to a fellow soldier who, reaching out, put his head above the parapet and was killed by a sniper's bullet. In all, 200... He recounts the story that on Christmas Eve in 1914, as darkness was falling and the fighting ceased for the day, as the soldiers sat back in their cold, wet trenches, a God-forsaken place, hell on earth, they settled in to have something to eat and drink and to try and get some rest. And as I was sitting back, he saw this light in the eastern sky, just above the German trenches. It was too low to be a star, and he looked and was wondering why no one shot at it. And then a second and a third and many similar lights appeared above the German trenches up and down the Western Front. And then all of a sudden, half a dozen deep baritone voices, the most beautiful sound he'd heard in this still night, saying, "Still Nacht, Heilig Nacht," silent night, holy night. And when they'd finished, the British troops cheered and responded with the first Noel. And the serenading went backward and forward for nearly an hour before some of the Germans got out of their trenches and walked into no man's land with their hands in their pockets. The Brits, not sure whether this was a clever trick or took the risk, and they themselves got out and walked across. And they shook hands with the Germans and wished each other Happy Christmas. In Jim Prince's part of the front, he remembers coming out and shaking hands with a German who said to him, in stilted English, "I'm a Saxon, you're an Anglo-Saxon. Why are we enemies? Why do we fight and kill each other?" It was a question that haunted Jim Prince for the rest of his life, one to which he found no answer. He lived to 85 years of age, and the question rattled him. Why were they fighting and killing each other? They continue to extend the hospitality to one another before retreating back to their trenches, but agreeing that there would be a truce the next day. It would continue. This was despite, like in the background, popes and archbishops and that were calling for a truce to the war, and particularly at Christmas. But the leaders of the nations of the fighting wouldn't have a bar of it and expected the fighting to continue right through Christmas, even as they, I suppose, sat down to their Christmas lunch in peace. The next day dawned bright and cold and peaceful. There was not a sound across the Western Front as the truce continued. And the soldiers came out in no man's land. They shared food and Christmas greetings. They had games of football up and down the Western Front, knockabout affairs with tin cans as balls and helmets as goals. In one part, a Scot miraculously produced a real football. In some parts, there were barbers from the Brits who were giving haircuts to the Germans, and a German juggler entertaining the troops with his magic. In one part, a British chaplain and a German divinity student held funerals for the dead, both German and British. And this truce continued not only through that day, but in some parts for up to a week. In Jim Prince's section, it lasted till the 29th of December. One of the Germans wrote home and said it had to last that long because we wanted to see how their photos of us turned out. For Jim Prince, this was the most profound Christmas he'd ever experienced, or would ever experience. In this God-forsaken hell on earth, Christmas came. It broke in the least expected place. in this hell on earth place of war, of fighting, of conflict, of cold, wet, horrible trenches, Christmas broke in and filled his life with hope. Christmas does that. It breaks into the world in the least likely places, where we least expect it. As Luke tells his story of Christmas, Christmas comes to a young woman, or a young girl really, a teenager. Mary is betrothed to be married. And in a world where angels and the world is enchanted and spirits and angels, and the belief that powerful and significant figures are actually the product of divine and human intercourse. It's a different world. And when she's met with an angel in Luke's story who says, "You are blessed of God and you will bear a child." "How can I? I'm a virgin," she says. "The Spirit will come upon you." It's a wonderful story that this insignificant, lowly, anonymous, powerless, helpless young girl is blessed of God. And Luke goes to great extremes to show the contrast. There's people who live in powerful places, palaces and castles and temples, and who have power and might and authority and wealth and prosperity, who live in the big cities. And yet God's angel comes to this girl in a nowhere place. And as the story continues, she is pregnant and she goes off to speak with her cousin, Elizabeth. Her cousin is older and didn't think she could have children, and she too is blessed with a child. And she stands in the long tradition of biblical women who can't have children but then in later age are blessed. And their children become significant leaders of the people. Hers becomes John the Baptist. And as these two women celebrate their pregnancies, Mary sings a song. She's recognised that her, in her vulnerability, her lowliness, has been lifted up, blessed of God. And that God takes the little ones and lifts them up. And she sings a song not as the world is, but as it can and should be. She sees in this experience what the world can be and should be, and God wants for the world. Where the little ones are lifted up and the big and mighty are brought down. And there's equality and justice and hope and peace for all people. And she sings this prophetic song. And the story continues. In this world of power and might and celebrity and fame and wealth and power, there's two people, Mary and Joseph, insignificant, impoverished people. In a world where there's Caesar Augustus and Quirinius as governor of Syria and King Herod's on the throne around Jerusalem, these two are part of a census, and they come south to the hometown of Joseph. It's not really a town, it's a village, it's an insignificant little place, a backwater. He goes there to register. And after this journey, long journey, they're tired, they're weary, they're dirty. They seek a place to sleep, but there's no room, there's nowhere. And they find a cattle stall, filthy and dirty and smelly. And that is where the Christ child is born. In Luke's story, the Christ child is born in a dirty, smelly, filthy stable, amongst the animals. And the only ones who hear the angel chorus that Luke describes in the sky are poor, marginalised, filthy shepherds who come seeking this king that's born, this newborn child, king, and they worship. This story turns the world upside down. The world as it can and should be, not as it is. Christmas breaks into the lives of people who are little, anonymous, insignificant, not powerful and mighty. Even the religious leaders don't get it. And this is Luke's story. And this is what Luke is saying about Christmas. Don't look for it in the big and powerful, mighty places. Don't look for it in the spectacular. Don't look for it in the opulent and prosperous. Look for it in the broken places. Look for it where humans suffer pain and struggle. When we ask the deep questions, when we're burnt down to the bone by struggle or life or whatever it is, and we don't know what to do. Christmas is born there. Christ comes to us. Christ comes to a black woman who's tired, not just tired in her body after a day's work, but tired of spirit, tired of being abused and treated as a second-class citizen. She's sitting on a bus, and white people get on, and she's asked to get up and move to the back of the bus, and maybe stand even. But she's tired. She's tired of all this. She's tired of giving in. She's tired. And Rosa Parks sits her ground and refuses to move. And so it starts a movement. And that movement takes off as other people see the world not as it is, but as it can and should be. And they start to believe. And a movement grows. And a young preacher who's great with rhetoric and speaking, and he's a leader, he's tapped on the shoulder and said, "Martin, you're the leader of us." And young Martin Luther King Jr. has dreams and visions, not of the world as it is, but as it can and should be. A world that's inclusive, a world that doesn't treat people based on the colour of their skin, their ethnicity or their differences, but on the quality of their character, and embraces all as sisters and brothers. It's a world that can be, a world in the heart of God, that God's dream for the world is this one of justice and love and equality, where peace and joy and hope fill the lives of all people, where people have enough to eat and drink, where there's life to share, where they're embraced into community and given esteem and dignity and respect. This is the world that God dreams of, the world as it can be, the world that Christmas breaks in to reveal to us, as it did to Jim Prince, who lived with that moment of Christmas all his life, and it never left him. It's the world that we yearn for. When we look into the news and see conflicts in Gaza and Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and Russia and wherever else in the world, when we see the pandemics of domestic violence, when we see violence in our streets and the hatred towards other groups and people, exclusion, when we see people going hungry and thirsty, or dying of simple diseases that have simple remedies if they could only get the treatments. The dream is that the world can return to a place that's peaceful, where all have life and hope, where all have a share in the joy and the wonder that is God's promise for everyone. That's Christmas. When we see into this, when we see the possibility and the potential, this is Christmas. And Christmas comes to us in the least likely places, where there's brokenness and hopelessness and pain. This is Christmas, when we reach out in love and hope. When we trust in this God who comes in amazing and wondrous and awe-inspiring ways to touch our lives, to give us dreams and visions, to give us courage to reach out, to be people of justice and love. Christmas comes. May Christmas come into your life, into the lives of those around you, your family and friends, your community. And as you reach out into the world with acts of love and generosity and kindness and compassion, may Christmas come and bring light and hope to our world. A world that can be, not the world that it is. May Christmas come. May Christmas shine in our lives, not just this one day of the year, but every day. Amen.